So my colleague Mato and I just presented this paper at the Academy of International Business conference in Latin America, and it was a great presentation. I figured I would just present it now for recording, just to kind of keep it, and hopefully it can influence some people. This research has not been actually executed on. The research itself, the methodology, the proposal, it's all in the beginning phases. We applied for the Institutional Review Board approval to execute the research, and we're waiting to hear back from them. So we're still needing to execute the study, and we're still needing to write up the results. But the title is Corporate Social Responsibility and Consumer Purchase Intention Within a Global Crisis. It's a cross-regional study. The general topics of this study encompass things like moral leadership, consumer behavior, corporate social responsibility, business strategy, and brand management. And also, corporate philanthropy and business solidarity are some other ones to add to that as well. The research question is, what is the effect of corporate social responsibility motives on consumer purchase intention within a global crisis? The research problem was sort of formulated upon managing a mid-sized company right after the announcement and the ensuing chaos around the COVID-19 crisis of 2020, and some of the confusion within the crisis that business leaders didn't quite know how to respond to their CSR initiatives. And one of which would be just a simple example we had at our organization of whether or not we execute on a philanthropic event that we had planned for the coming weeks, despite some of the kickback. And we decided to execute on it anyways, and not for intrinsic reasons, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and some of the impact that that can have on the people to see that leaders and executives are continuing to do such things and even double downing on such initiatives after uncertainty and during a crisis. So the research problem there is a disparity of regionally specific empirical information to equip organizational CSR initiators and strategic decision makers to justify decisions for CSR initiatives in response to global crisis. This disparity is because many business professionals are unaware of the impact of CSR efforts on corporate outcomes. Corporate outcomes, we're studying an outcome variable of consumer purchase intention, and especially how these might be strengthened depending on the culture during a crisis. So the research model, briefly looking at it, corporate social responsibility motives, this is a big key aspect. It's the independent variable in this study. The motives are either intrinsic or extrinsic. We'll elaborate on that. And the moderating variable, the strengthening variable in this model is consumer information seeking behavior, ISB, and then it moves into a mediator of brand trust, and the outcome variable, the dependent variable, is purchase intention from the consumer. And all while this model is taking effect in the context of a global crisis, or what we're calling a black swan event. And the constructs to further define them, the CSR motives, this is the corporate strategists that are coming up with the plans and executing on these plans for CSR motives post crisis. Are they intrinsic, helping society, or are they extrinsic, helping the company? And that these motives matter. Consumer information seeking behavior is heightened after a crisis. It's heightened during times of uncertainty, therefore making the impact of these motives and of the CSR initiatives a little bit more, or we're hypothesizing, we're asserting that they're going to have more of an impact in certain cultures after a crisis and during a crisis. Global, because of that, information seeking behavior is different. The sensitivity is different. The researching of a consumer is different, more intense. Global crisis is a low probability, high impact situation that is perceived by critical stakeholders to threaten the viability of an organization, is sort of how we define that. And there's a lot of other definitions as well. And a global pandemic is a disease movement, high attack rates, explosiveness. COVID-19 is a perfect example of that. I put these two other constructs a little bit lower on the list and also a little bit grayer because brand trust and purchase intentions are pretty intuitive. We know what they mean. We know what they are. We know their importance. Trust is very important, and corporate social responsibility has been demonstrated in the literature to build trust or hinder it, depending on what kind of corporate social initiatives you have. The cultural differences are why this is cross-regional. It's cross-cultural. We believe, and we're making some hypothesis and some assertions that that these responses to a crisis with CSR initiatives and these motives are going to be perceived and have a different impact depending on the culture. Collectivist culture, they have a preference towards domestic products over foreign products, regardless of product quality. And that's just a known aspect of what the collectivist cultures tend to have. And obviously, that's going to change the way in which you invest in CSR initiatives. They feel the impact of social causes on an entire community or a region, and some of their goals, attitudes, and values are based on the group of persons and not on themselves. Individualist, United States and Canada are the two examples that we're going to survey as known individualist countries, and of course, Brazil and Colombia are known collectivist countries. And individualists are not needing to be defined, just more of their family unit, their coworkers, their fellow countrymen themselves, how the impact is on them as opposed to the group or the collective. And you would just market to them differently. They would probably, we're hypothesizing, they would be less sensitive to understanding motives. They don't care as much whether it's an altruistic, intrinsic, pro-social motive, or if it's just a quality is what they're more interested in. And the question is, during a global crisis, does that pan out pan out true for individuals countries, or are they also acting as collectivist countries act as well due to the fact that there's a crisis? Do they come together in a more cohesive way? So the research methodology, real quick, it's a unit of analysis is the consumer individuals quantitative study. We're hoping for a sample size of around 1,500 participants. We're going to use a mechanism called Amazon Mechanical Turk. Our survey design is going to have different motives. That is going to be a scenario we're going to lay out for the participant to understand the context, and then we're going to ask them a series of questions about their information seeking and their purchase intention and their brand loyalty, their brand trust, based on the scenarios. And then we're going to sample the four countries of United States, Canada, Brazil, and Colombia. Contributions of this research, big deal. We believe that these contributions are going to help us learn and grow in an applied moral leadership context. Is what does our morality brought upon in our organization as leaders, and doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do? How does that actually tangibly, objectively impact the outcomes of our organization? Is it worthy? Is it obviously it's the right thing to do, but how can we measure that? And is it more intensified during the times of a global crisis? Are consumers more prone to follow companies and trust companies that are acting in a moral, intrinsic fashion, caring about society with a good motive during those times of crisis? Better understand the objectivity on consumer information seeking behavior during crisis. We believe we're just in an opportune time to understand consumer behavior, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. Black Lives Matter, and we want to sample consumers during this time with contextual variables so that we can study it. Convey the importance of establishing a CSR platform prior to a crisis and start building trust prior to a crisis, because that way, when a crisis hits, you could just invest more into your CSR initiatives if it pans out to be the right thing to do, as opposed to starting to build something real quick after a crisis happens and all of a sudden shift your image to the consumer as, oh, we're going to start doing these initiatives now. No, this is important to do prior to a crisis, to build this foundation so that when a crisis hits, you're prepared to capitalize on some of those previous initiatives that you've done already, and you just do more of it. And you already have the resources and the infrastructure and the processes set up. Participate in CSR initiatives in response to a crisis. Talked about that. Once a crisis hits, capitalize on an existing CSR program. Tailor the CSR initiatives and motive conveyance strategies based on regional and cultural differences. This is a big one. We talk about, are we going to be espousing our motives the same way in Colombia and Brazil as we would in the United States and Canada, and the timeline in which we would discuss these things after a crisis, and in what fashion do we do it, and how many resources, or what's the extent of resources we put into that conveyance of that particular motive, and how do we speak to the consumer, and what does that look like? And we believe that it will differ depending on the cultures, which is pretty intuitive. Increase brand trust and purchase intentions through altruistic and intrinsic motive conveyance. We talked about that. Lots of hypotheses behind these. Improve CSR decisions across different cultures during a global crisis. Some of the next steps we're going to do, I talked about, we need to seek IRB approval, run a pilot study, research study, administer the survey, write up the results, and potentially add some interviews or qualitative data as well. So that is the research study that my friend Mano and I just presented at the Academy of International Business, and hopefully we can execute this study, write up the results, and publish the paper on what we find. Thank you.